So we are continuing with our previous discussion about how Iqbal tried to see how we saw human ego in its various manifestations. Though the notions of self depends how you can see poetically as well as in prose in the passages which are given here. Means we normally say the notion of self or ego is one of the central themes in Iqbal's philosophy. So it what short engenders us to ask a larger question. So what do you mean by self? So how is it related with human body and maybe the whole objective world, and how is it related with some supreme being, whether it's having an immanent character or a transcendent character, and how does the ego emerge as a unified system? And when you say emerge, so how does that emergent emerge in that sense? So you can have, there are pantheistic doctrines as well as the monotheistic doctrines. So you can say that maybe apart from trying to see, this is a separate debate, how Iqbal tried to conflate the way pantheistic way of looking at things, how it leads to sort of inaction, and it was maybe, for example, people like Ibn Arabi and Shankaracharya, for example, who held that Brahman was the ultimate reality. So that's one of the topics. But the larger question is, how does Iqbal ground these questions in the times he was living in? So he was influenced by the way he was trying to defend a certain epistemology, a religious epistemology, which was under attack from, you can say, modern day materialists, or you can say dualists, or you can say in our times the way we try to see the physicalistic interpretation of consciousness, slash the non-physicalistic interpretation of consciousness. Moreover, you can include dualists, you can include panpsychists, you can include occasionalists, you can include subjective idealists. So these are different terms, but each different maybe lenses, and maybe each lens has something unique to address to this very fundamental question. So apart from the way Descartes saw, the Descartian dualism is normally seen as if the chasm between body and soul in that sense. So here maybe and how maybe cause and effect in that sense they are related. So if mind and matter, body and soul, these are all dual ways of looking at things, and it creates a perfect chasm, unbridgeable chasm, which leads to a binary or duality. Maybe Iqbal is trying to, or saying he's trying to see this wield this larger these questions into a particular religious epistemology, where you can connect these questions of how we can see role of human ego, his freedom, his freedom and his appreciation of these binaries or dualities can be dissolved or resolved by trying to see how we can realize a creator, or we can realize the ultimate realities of self, which recognizes that reality in that sense. So for example, in that thing, he just maybe rescues, or he tries to find place of human ego in that larger discussion in that sense. So the more important point is the discussion about materialism. So is material be all or end all, or reductive materialism, trying to trying to connect, reduce everything in the conscious activity as being a part of some reductive materialistic way of looking at things. Um, and maybe or trying to physicalize things, or physicalistic view of consciousness, if we can use the if you can use the term we use nowadays in that sense. So here, what we are going to do, we are going to read some selected passages and maybe connect it with the larger way how Iqbal tried to see things in that sense. So, for example, before coming to what Iqbal tries to say, so I'll just use these are words of Dr. Abdul Hakim. His how in Asrar Khudi, how he interprets Iqbal, or his interpretation. That's a very poignant passage, which will set the debate for the larger things. So it's in Urdu. Maybe I can translate some aspects of it if I feel so. So what he says is that इंसान की नजर बातिन से पहले खारिज पर पड़ती है. आंख खारिज की हर शय को देखती है लेकिन अपने आप को नहीं देख सकती. कहते हैं इरफान की 3 किस्में या 3 पहलू हैं: दुनिया शनासी, खुदा शनासी और खुद शनासी. यूनानी मुफक्किरीन इर्तिकाई फिक्र में या खारिज से बातिन की तरफ आते गए. उन्होंने कश्फ मज़ाहिर में लतीफ़ हक़ाइक़ का खोज लगाना शुरू किया. पाइथागोरस ने देखा कि खारजी आलम में हर जगह तनासुब, तवाज़ुन और अंदाज़ा पाया जाता है. सुकरात, अफलातून और अरस्तु मादे से नफ्स की तरफ आए. नफ्स ने खारिज की तरफ से मुंह फेर कर बातिन का रुख कर दिया. तो इनका नफ्स अक्ल मंतकी का करिश्मा दिखाने लगी. खुदा आकिल नहीं बल्कि खुद अक्ल कुल है. वो खुद ही अपने शूर का मारूज है. So in this very dense and meaningful passage, what Dr. Abdul Hakim tries to say is that the way human consciousness, how the journey from outer world to the inner world, whether from Greeks, from Pythagoreans, from Greeks, it's gone through various stages, and in trying to find the realities of the world, external world, the realities ultimately led to the realities of our inner world in that sense. So, but those realities led us to an ultimate reality where God is not an act of meditation, but he is mind personified as whole, undivided whole in that sense. So he is self-conscious in his own being in that sense. So here maybe there are so also the question is so here also you can say the notion of time, which Iqbal also we discussed in the previous lectures, how time as a construct is also a sort of created construct. And in the estimation of Iqbal, time is a more fundamental property as compared to space. But for example, the past and future both operate in the present state of consciousness, and the future is not wholly undetermined. Death is only a passage to what Quran calls barzakh, or intermediate states, lost until the day of resurrection. So if Iqbal says the idea of time is adulterated, pure time has no length. By breaking up time and moment, we specialize it and then find difficulty in getting over it. The true nature of time is reached when we look into our deeper self. So trying to imagine time in terms of length, as if time is sort of movement, in that sense it's a sort of false ally in that sense, cannot go over it. So even the notion of time. So if space is not fundamental, external world is not whatever we see out, or time is more fundamental, but beneath the notion of time cannot, its ultimate reality or its ultimate thing can really be appreciated if we have peep into how we realize our self, nature of self. So the true nature of time is reached when we look into our deeper self. So what is the self? So normally when we talk of self, we use terms like cognition, evolution, teleology. So maybe in cognitive sciences and philosophy of biology, or philosophy of biology, or philosophy of cognitive sciences, they share these concepts of cognition, evolution, genetics, teleology. So maybe the physicalists, they still believe that, what I should say, they assume that behavior of nervous system, or behavior of these whatever how we know things, is compositionally determined by the behavior of its working units. It's the parts which make the whole, in that sense. So they don't take consciousness as something innate property in that sense. It's the working together of composite units which will let a certain reality or emergent reality which will come out in that sense. So the question is, how do cognitive sciences exactly relate to the biological sciences? So if you want, before we are trying to see, because Iqbal has not, he has used the notions of biology, emergent evolution, and other things in a background of trying to rescue a certain human freedom, which is going to appreciate the larger reality of Allah, or creator, or the thing. But he, in that sense, he's basically trying to say the physicalistic way of, or materialistic way of looking at things, which is dependent upon cause and effect, is sort of inadequate before coming to his point of view. So we are going to see, so before what that thing is, so we have to first see what are the arguments of physicalists, and then we can go for non-physicalistic view of consciousness in that sense. So among the physicalistic arguments of physicalism, or the causal ones, which have received most attention in literature, so the line of reasoning may be hinged on the compatibility between dualistic view and the following premises. Means mental properties have physical effects. All physical effects are caused by physically prior histories, or causal physical principles. Means no effect can be traced. Any effect which can be traced should have some physical cause. And the physical cause of effect of mental properties are not systematically overdetermined by physical determinism, or they are not physically overdetermined by mental and physical causes. Our behavior is overdetermined by mental and physical causes. Means physical and mental causes, they are be all and end all. Maybe sui generis, or in the class of arguments, or equivalence class of those arguments, in that sense, mental properties have no causal powers upon the physical domain. So you can always take the physical, these physical mental effects can have the physical effects, but how do physical effects affect the mental? It's not the other way around. So we'll always say that mental effects can be traced to some physical origins, but it's not the vice versa, whether physical origins can be traced to mental effects or not, in that sense. So there can be, there have been Leibniz pre-established harmony, or what I should say, occasionalism, as a where cause and effect may not necessarily be related. These ideas are there. Uh, the point is that the main schools, whether they are physicalists or dualists, they agree on 2 points. One, the causal efficacy, so mental properties have physical effects, and non-overdetermination means the physical effects of mental properties are not overdetermined by physical properties. But here comes a minor this thing, that how physicalists sometimes can reject dualists on the ground that causal arguments, without being committed to strong identity thesis between mental and the physical properties. Means in the dualists there is that chasm of me and the other, the world and mind and matter. So that that chasm is there. While in case of physicalists, the cause and effect are intimately somehow related. Every effect for the mental causes, every effect can be traced to the mental causes, the effect which was taking their place. So all physical effects are fully caused by purely physical prior histories. Physical. So this is known as causal closure principle. So the fact that scientists have never observed sui generis mental causation is perfectly compatible with existence of empirically undetectable mental forces. So maybe the thing is that how mental effects can produce physical causes, it has not been seen in that sense. So basically, if I just quote, we can always trace the mental causes to physical causes, but it's not the vice versa. Whether mental causes do effects do have physical causes. So in the domain of neurosciences, for example, if I quote one of the scientists, Koch, so who says in a very puzzling manner, so we are trying to understand human brain when we do not yet understand the worm brain in that sense. So in the sense, for example, in the simplest of way, how we can see biophysiologically in the vision, how our eye detects the colors, the depth, the length, the distance, shape perception, the color perception, or figure perception, or scene segmentation, object identification, or re-identification, or property identification and memorization. So these are very complex activities, you can say, in that sense. So for example, scientists are saying that the functional organization of visual brain and about the role of color vision plays in the perceptive economy of the organism. So if I just quote Francis Varela, is another cognitive scientist, who says that cognition as an intertwined network of interactions embedded in multi-level manifold, distinguished between endogenous process with organism and exogenous processes involving the environment. So consciousness for him is not a sort of an activity which is to be derived independently. It's an activity coming, but it's a certain interplay of factors, exogenous factors and indigenous factors in that sense, which corresponds to the organism and as well as the environment he may be living in. Now, question is how we can have the mind, the body, and the system in the same one or coherent or organic whole in that sense. So here we have to take into considerations how the non-physicalists will see consciousness in that sense. The non-physicalistic view of consciousness. So how does consciousness fit into the physical world, including our thoughts, sensations, and emotions? How do they relate to the brain and to the physical reality in general? So the predominant reality is that of physicalism, which holds that consciousness is purely a physical phenomenon. So why couldn't we just have physical property without conscious experience? So here, for example, which I am trying to say, which Iqbal, I just quote some passages of Iqbal also, whatever I have said. So the consciousness is purely a physical phenomenon. Why couldn't we just have this physical property without any conscious experience? So David Chalmers is one of the persons who is working on the field of consciousness, who says that neuroscience can only tell us which physical states or processes are correlated with conscious experience, not why correlations hold. So you can trace a particular effect to a particular cause, a particular physiological activity or neurophysiological activity or a particular cognitive function to a particular neurophysiological thing in that sense. But we cannot exactly say why those correlations should hold apart from physiological or physiochemical reasons. So the epistemic gap, that's gap between our physical knowledge or concepts and our mental knowledge or concepts, that the consciousness cannot be purely physical at all. So the older thing, the knowledge debate, what we know and the a priori forms which are there, and it corresponds to the physical reality. If it's not, the map is not exact or one to one, there is some residue which is left. So what we know and what we map things upon, it's not exact in that sense. So our conscious physicalistic way of trying to have a causal map, if it's not perfect, so there is the physicalistic interpretation of consciousness is not wholesome. And so people take physicalism in favor of theories like dualism, idealism, panpsychism, and in that sense. So here you can say or subject to idealism of Berkeley. So only where consciousness is only real, and the physical world is illusion in that sense. So here I quote some of the passage, whatever I have said. So Iqbal also says, for example, if I just see, for example, are then the soul and its organism two things in the sense of Descartes, independent of each other, though somehow mysteriously united. So this is an important exclamation or a question. But there is a there need to be no resemblance between cause and effect. This is what Iqbal also says. So how Iqbal tries to see it in that sense, how he resolves it. So he somehow they must belong to the same system. According to Quran, they do belong to the same system. To him belong to Khalq, creation, and Amr, direction. How is such a thing conceivable in that sense? So here in the coming passage, you can say he's trying to say that the minutest parts of the universe are conscious, and the way reductive materialism will try to define or divorce consciousness and its evolution to higher stages. So you can see it in that sense. So there are very couple of interesting questions. What Iqbal says, it's further clear that streams of causality flow into it from nature and from it to nature. Does the ego then determine its own activity? If so, how is the self-determination of ego related to the determinism of spatio-temporal order, which I was trying to say? trying to see human ego in the larger thing of space and time. Is personal causality a special kind of causality or only a disguised form of mechanism of nature? So we can say these non-physicalistic views of consciousness, which not only includes subject to idealism, but also occasionalism, or also maybe consciousness taking as an epiphenomena in that sense. The view that ego activity is a succession of thoughts and ideas, ultimately resolvable, uh, in that sense to units of sensation, is only another form of atomic materialism which forms the modern base of modern science. So maybe it was in 1930s, but it has the strong currents are there in 2025 also, that ego activity is a succession of thoughts ultimately resolved in units of sensations, is only another form of atomic materialism which forms the basis of modern science. So the essential purposive action of vision act is its vision of a form situation which does not appear to admit any explanation in terms of physiology. So in that sense. And in that sense, what Iqbal is trying to say, for example, he says how basically he wants to rescue, why he is maybe critiquing materialism or critiquing this way of looking at consciousness. He is basically trying to rescue a certain he wants to have some space for things which are religious or which are divine in that sense. For example, he says the timing of daily prayer, which according to Quran restores self-possession to the ego by bringing it closer touch with the ultimate source of life and freedom, and intends to save the ego from the mechanizing effect of sleep and business in that sense. So consciousness as a creative thing, it's not something mechanical. You being conscious, so if you are being mechanical, it will dim you, it will the slumber, the sleep will be there. The consciousness as an activity which will let you to come to the deeper realities is very much important in that sense. So you have to just you have to revisit conscious or conscious activity which is not entirely materialistic in that sense. So now, so if consciousness and physicalism work. So consciousness can be understood as a, so if we just see consciousness in terms of, I'll come back to physicalism. So consciousness can be understood as the ability to think and reason, the ability to register and process information about one's environment and oneself, or a general reflective awareness. It's how we see consciousness in the general sense. So it's phenomenal consciousness. That's mainly the debate between the physicalists and the non-physicalists in that sense. So for physicalists, consciousness is identical to the physical states or processes, means physical facts, events, or whatever categories you may prefer. So that's the states or processes to the brain and to the physical reality in general. So the predominant physicalistic way of looking at consciousness, whether from philosophy or from physical sciences, is basically trying to see the physicalistic way of looking at things in that sense. So if properties are physical, so physicalism also comes in two varieties in that sense. So the way I was trying of these mind-body correlators, or the new idea of physical closure. or the ideas that things have worked previously also, so they will work in future. How things have worked. So if you go to any neurologist or any neurosurgeon, he will say, for example, you can have direct connection between, for example, if you have brain tumors, if you have Alzheimer, or if you have an accident in brain surgery, or colostomy, or so electro in psychiatrists say there is electro the stimulation of drugs like LSD. So you can see the PET and MRI scans, the physical correlations can be seen. The correlators are there. So the question is the physical way of correlators, which operate on the principle of which is known as supervenience, which means so if A supervenes B, there can be no change in A without a change in B. So you can directly see the relation. But question is this the argument of the physical causal closure in that sense? Means mind-brain correlators focuses on how the brain affects the consciousness, and consciousness focuses on how the consciousness affects the brain or body in the physical world in the general. So if consciousness is non-physical, it's hard to see how the possible view of principle of physical causal closure. Means physicalism offers at least a plausible way of securing mental causation in that sense. So it's a strong argument in that sense. But how do non-physicalists see? So non-physicalists, the theories of consciousness, in the physicalistic view of consciousness, this physicalism is a default view of consciousness in philosophy as well as sciences. So the question is, they have non-physicalists have construed or constructed their own sort of arguments without maybe going to the detail of those arguments, which may be the knowledge argument, the conceivability argument, the explanatory argument. So the more important thing which I would rather focus on apart from the other arguments is which I talked also of, is that of convenientiality argument, which claims that it's conceivable that consciousness comes apart from the physical, but there is an epistemic gap and the physicalistic responses. Means, for example, what there is, or what reality fundamentally consists of. How can you explain them from the non-physicalistic understanding of our consciousness? So if non-physicalists will say that the epistemic gap, so what exists out there and what is in your mind, they don't exactly correlate. They may correlate in some sense, but they don't exactly correlate in that sense. So but from a non-physicalistic opinion, how can you account for the physicalistic way of explaining things in a causal manner? So here maybe Wittgenstein, Quine, Kripke, they argue that no physical facts determine whether someone apparently performing addition is not actually. So they have used the term quasiadditive. Means if you say the whole is the sum of parts, or the sum of parts make more than a whole. So if the constituent parts, when they are in action and when the causation principle is applied, they explain things, but what they explain, it's always less, or it's the residue always remains there, or it's not perfect in that sense. So the question is, so the interaction problem comes into being. So the way Hume said it, the point that you can see causation, you can see things For example, Hume famously said that we cannot explain or understand the connection between cause and effect, as all we perceive is cause being followed by effect, but nothing that binds them together. So maybe not everybody will accept this human argument as completely unintelligible in that sense. And how does dualism also respond to the arguments of physicalism, where there is an epistemic gap between the mental and the physical in terms of data? So, a lot of non-physicalists choose consciousness as an epiphenomena in that sense, over determination, over the causal determination, or the denial of what I should say, physical causal closure. So non-physicalists what support the epistemic gap from physical and phenomenal. So that is what it is like for us to be in the conscious states in that sense. So here, whatever I have said, maybe Iqbal has also tried to. If you see one of the paragraphs, he says, for example, but he connects it with the larger debate of immortality in that sense, and also how human ego operates. So where he somehow critiques the medieval notions of how the theory of justice, which people, if God or a creator, if cause and effect is taken in a strict causal way, and in the way medieval these scholars may be impressed upon by these Greek scholars, Greek way of looking, how they try to see God as the ultimate creator. He is the first cause in that sense. So, in that sense, they saw the world, the activities of the world, the justice, or whatever happens in the world is basically it's God ultimately. He is the cause of that we think. So we should not. So we should be accept the reality, the injustices of the world. So the Iqbal is also connecting these questions to those larger questions. But apart from that, the notions of materialism, which he says, for example, materialism which rejects immortality, holding that consciousness is merely a function of brain, therefore ceases with the cessation of brain processes. So taking consciousness all only to reductive materialism. So William James thinks that this objection of immortality is valid only if the function of question is taken to be product. The mere fact that certain mental changes vary concomitantly with certain bodily change does not warrant the inferences that mental changes are produced by bodily changes. Again, so this is the important point, which Iqbal also tries to come to that the causation is not necessarily a foolproof way of taking a physicalistic way of looking at consciousness, lock, stock, and barrel in that sense. So, how it's related with free will or immortality, or what's the relationship of mind and brain in that sense? So, maybe, for example, in the philosophy of mind, which encompasses maybe a range of questions like subjective experience, perception, intelligence, emotions, role of mental and physical universe, or maybe in how people from psychology, neurology, cognitive sciences, AI, computer sciences, and even robotics, how they see these things. So the question is, do we have more plausible options? If Descartes said that, for example, Descartes thought that mind meets body in the pineal gland. This was his way of trying to physicalize the mind and body problem in that sense. But in the wake of our schools, a lot of schools which you can see, whether it's Cartesian dualism, whether it's epiphenomenalism, conscious activity as an emergent activity after a certain stage, or occasionalism, which believes that there is no link, so it's taking things to the extreme, no link between the physical and the mental, or there is reductive materialism, eliminative materialism, or there is also parallelism, where the consciousness, there is no causal link between mental and the physical in that sense. So here comes then, why should we take the empiricist's way of looking at empiricist theory of perception in that sense, which has been a dominant theory. So, which, if I just say there can be two things, means part one means how things appear in terms of how other things are, and how do we infer things in that sense. So apart from maybe there can be various layers. Iqbal is not only on one side trying to rescue a certain non-physicalistic view of consciousness, or non-materialistic view of consciousness, but he is also not of the opinion of, for example, Iqbal sees Hindu intellectualism and Islamic pantheism have destroyed the capacity for action based on scientific observation of interpretation of phenomena, which distinguishes it from the Western people in that sense. So he's not also taking, he's not also totally denying the physicalistic way of looking at things also in that sense, the scientific value to it. So in that sense, so this says what this maybe asks us maybe what is the origin of self, whatever the debate we are going to see it. Now we are going to see it in the way, for example, in the Abrahamic religion, the more question is, who am I in that sense? And the answer is that that physical self, at least its important aspects of selfhood and everything that is valuable about me, is contained in the metaphysical self, or which we call soul. Soul has become a more a pejorative term, or it's a term not used nowadays. So, but this is the way things are. So, if we say, and if we take Kant's way of looking at things, knowledge, you cannot know things in themselves, but things as they exist for you in that sense. So, for Kant, knowledge, self-knowledge was not concern of philosophy, and that we could really never know ourselves in that absolute sense. In that sense, so so Nietzsche may be taking upon on this maybe this Spencer's observation, and maybe Spencer's Darwinian evolutionary calculus. He talks of something called survival of the fittest. Maybe Nietzsche proposed a sort of self-awareness in human species, means if you can transcend the way the societal part of it, if you can if you can go, your ego goes, it somehow bypasses the ego, it translates the limits of selfhood. You will reach to a sort of Ubermensch, the Superman, which you call. But the thing is that Nietzsche also doesn't talk of what is the consciousness of that. If this Superman is an end in itself, what the conscious activity, what it is for in that sense. Or Freudian ego and superego, the triad, which you can see, which are the cognitive elements of the psyche in that sense. Or how does the self know itself in that sense? So maybe in the recent anthropology as a subject in the last century, maybe they have also invested to some extent in the question of self. But maybe anthropology as a subject was in its initial stages, it was basically as a subject, it was basically a sort of subject for imperial ambitions of European states, where they of 18th and 19th century, where they in the first their effort was to identify the failure and the weakness of other cultures or civilizations to be exploited or to be subjugated. Maybe they had a particular way of looking at self, and a lot of theories which come with those anthropological and this matrix, the epistemology matrix, it has to be taken with a pinch of salt if they are the way they look at these self, the studies of self in that sense, or they will deny it in that, they will demean it in that sense. So if quoting Chinese philosophers, maybe Lao Tao's, so he says, where does the self come from? He who knows others is wise. He who knows himself is enlightened. So for Pythagoras, no one is free who has not obtained empire of himself. For Socrates, true wisdom comes when we know little. We know about life, ourselves, and world. We are conscious that we know very little. We know that we do not know much in that sense. And there can be metaphors of the self, just like the south is metaphor, hell is the other. You can also have the self is the other, or other self represents a similar cognitive equivalence to the self in that sense. Or I am me in that sense means me as a person may contain a lot of, there's a particular quotation, I contradict myself. This means I am great. Means me, there are various contradictions, and with those contradictions, I exist as a whole in that sense. So the self has not only maybe the actual self is basically unknowable in that labyrinth, in that iceberg. You can only see if we want to have pointers, or if you want to have some anchors. So you can have self, you can have cultural self, where you want to see how the self should be, or you have your own self. You have narrative self, which you only remember in your memory, or you have a projective self, which you want others to see. You have what I should say, episodic self, where you only remember things. You have social self in that sense. So you can have these different selves. They make an ultimate self. So where free will maybe is an emergent outcome of being immersed in a complex environment, and self-awareness is emergent property of the free will, which Iqbal is also trying to somehow strives to see. He wants to rescue a certain sort of freedom or free will, which God or Creator has enjoined you as human beings on earth, whichever way you want to go. It's not that if I use an Urdu poet, ना हक हम मजबूरों पे तोहमत है मुख्तारी की, चाहते सो आप हैं हमको बस बदनाम किया. Yeah, in that sense. But it's like Iqbal is also trying to just come up with this thing, these category notions of self. But here at the end, if you see, for example, I have already indicated in these lectures the proper way to meet the materialism. So he's this thing. So now the question is, what's the also the at the end what he wants to say. So there are other aspects of man, such as evaluation, the unitary character of purposive existence, and the pursuit of truth, which science must necessarily exclude from its study, and the understanding of which requires categories other than those employed by science. So here Even though Iqbal is not, he is saying he is not a reductive materialist, but he is also appreciating the physicalistic way to a certain extent, that there can be correlate causes in that sense. Brain as a conscious activity and how it's related in that sense. But the physicalistic way of so you are trying to say that you need some other categories, uh, and maybe the scientific pursuit of trying to see these things are not adequate, or they are not, when once you employ them, they are not adequate in that sense. Maybe this sentence can be seen in the way how we can see the non-physicalistic way of consciousness, where occasionalism and where parallelism can be seen also that way. That some aspects of consciousness can be physicalistic in that sense, but deep down, the consciousness as a property, it's a non-physicalistic in character in that sense. And it's also, you can also extrapolate or extend the understanding of consciousness, how we can see society, larger society, the justice, the injustices, the way we have to live. That's another part of the debate. And whether the belief that human ego is mortal, the mortality, so you become part of the world, a sort of deism is there. It's not be all and or and all of whatever I have said. So today's lecture, I tried to see the consciousness, the Iqbalian way of looking at consciousness, the ego, the physicalistics, and the non-physicalistic way of consciousness. The correlates, the epistemic indication of a physicalistic way of looking at consciousness, and how non-physicalistic way of looking at consciousness can be helpful in some ways in that sense. So maybe I've tried to connect things in whatever way. Hope you will like today's lecture. Thanks for listening.